Hey, listeners, before this week's episode, I want to tell you about our podcast sponsor, Plain Joe Studio, and how they could help you in your church. You know, our most recent Unstuck Church report said that the average church is actually growing by 14% year over year. That means that there are a lot of churches that are paying more attention to their worship space than ever. Well, the creative team at Plain Joe works with churches to create beautiful, engaging spaces that connect with their community. They have a team of architectural, design, and branding experts who help transform worship spaces into attractive, engaging hubs for the community. If that's an area that your church could use some help, reach out to them today at plainjoe.net. Well, welcome back to the Unstuck Church podcast. I'm Sean, your host, here again with Amy Anderson, and we are in episode 2 of our series, Structured for Burnout. If you missed episode 1, do yourself a favor, go back and listen to that one. Last week, Amy and I got into the specific structural moves that kind of quietly set the lead pastor up for burnout. Things like siloed org chart, span of care that's completely out of control, and the classic move of the lead pastor trying to be both the visionary leader and the integrator at the same time. Here's a spoiler, that doesn't end well. Today, we're going one level deeper. We're talking about the senior leadership team, that team of people that actually sit at the top of your org chart. What should it actually look like? How do the roles need to be defined? And honestly, why getting the senior leadership team right might be the single most important structural decision the church ever makes. So, Amy, with that introduction, let's get into it.
Yeah, I'm so glad we're doing this episode because episode 1 was all about diagnosing the problem. Like, here's how your structure is creating the conditions for burnout. This episode is really about the prescription. Like, if the SLT, the senior leadership team, maybe you call it a management team, executive team, if it's structured well, you can actually take the lid off your church and create space for more sustained health. And if it's not, you'll likely keep funneling everything back up to the top of the organization.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's name the tension first. Most churches have a senior leadership team, or at least they think they do. What's actually going on in a lot of churches that we work with?
Yeah, what I see in many churches, what they call their senior leadership team is really just like a collection of ministry directors who happen to report to the lead pastor. There's really no shared ownership of the whole church, just ownership of each leader's ministry area, ministry silo. And when there's no SLT function, every cross ministry decision seems again to escalate back up to the lead pastor. So again, as we said last week, that's where the lead pastor becomes the only integrating force in the organization. And we talked last week about how exhausting and unsustainable that is.
Yeah.
Sean, our founder and friend Tony Morgan used to say, a personality might draw a crowd, a weekend crowd, but it takes a team to create healthy systems that foster sustained growth. And the SLT is that team. Without it, you're depending on heroism at the top.
And here's what I'd add to that. This problem doesn't just wear out the lead pastor. It actually puts a ceiling, I think, on the whole church. So, Amy, what's actually at stake structurally when the SLT isn't functioning the way that it should?
Yeah, well, the capacity of the team really determines the potential impact of the ministry overall. So if the team is missing the right people, or if the roles aren't clear, or leaders aren't empowered to actually lead, that's when the church will hit a lid. And, we see this play out at churches of all sizes. A smaller church where the lead pastor is doing everything, a mid-sized church that's growing, but the structure hasn't caught up yet, right? And then a larger church where the senior leadership team, like I said, is technically in place, but no one really owns that cross-organizational alignment, that integration we talked about last week. And in all those cases, all those examples, burnout is just lurking because someone at the top, someone is absorbing all that dysfunction.
Okay, let's talk about solutions to this. And let's start with the lead pastor specifically, because I think a lot of lead pastors would struggle to articulate what their actual role on the SLT is. So what are the things the senior pastor simply cannot hand off no matter how busy things get?
Yeah, I'll share those. It's funny, Sean, when I find a pastor of kind of like a fast growing church, when I share these 4 things, they're like, that would be a dream if that was all that I had to do. And so let's make that dream a reality. It does work. I've seen it installed. But yeah, there are 4 roles we talk about frequently that the senior pastor can't delegate. And being clear on these is the first part of structuring a senior leadership team well. So the lead pastor owns the primary responsibility for helping people buy into the vision. They're the primary vision caster. You can develop vision with a team. In fact, we recommend developing vision with input from a team, but the person who needs to cast that is the senior pastor. That cannot be delegated. The second is being the spiritual leader and teacher at the church. So, this teaching role is unique to other organizations. It's unique to the senior pastor. You can have a teaching team. And again, we recommend having teaching teams, but the lead pastor leads it and takes ownership of the consistency, of the excellence of teaching, right? If Sunday prep is getting crowded out by management tasks, fires, that's a structural problem because that should not be landing on their lap. Third, we call it the leader of leaders. So the senior pastor has to develop the people around them, not just direct them, not just be around a table with them. This is the leadership pathway, right? You lead by example, then you delegate, then you empower, and then you envision. So if you're still, as a lead pastor, just leading by example, your church is probably stuck, or organizationally, you've got some stuckness in there. And then the fourth one, of course, is just the lead pastor has to be the culture champion. The lead pastor is the keeper of the culture, and no one else can own that from the top. It can be supported by other senior leadership team members, and it needs to be, but that lead pastor sets culture.
I love that list because, it's not just a job description for the senior pastor, it's also a filter. If you're spending most of your week on the things that aren't on that list, that's not a time management problem, it's a structure problem. And I think that leads us to the executive pastor role then, because this is where things get murky fast in a lot of churches. So Amy, what should the XP actually own?
Yeah, we talked about this a little bit last week, but let me recap and add some things. The executive pastor, we often call the integrator. It's the person who takes the vision that the lead pastor is responsible for and makes it operational. So they fill that gap between vision and execution. Because that's an important one, because I do think a lot of executive pastors, because they have such a broad purview to everything going on in the organization, I think they often are at risk of being in the weeds and not staying at that integrator higher level role. In a healthy senior leadership team, the lead pastor, of course, is leading up and out, casting vision, championing culture, developing key leaders. Whereas the executive pastor is managing, right, the day-to-day operations and making sure the whole system is aligned and moving. The executive pastor leads the senior leadership team meeting, and the senior pastor is present and engaged in those meetings, but doesn't have to facilitate it. I think the murkiness then, if that's a high level overview, the murkiness happens when the lead pastor, of course, holds on to that XP role too long, or when the church hasn't really named the integrator function at all. Then again, although the lead pastor absorbs it by default. And we talked about this last week, but leaders are doing instead of leading, and the lead pastor is trying to be both the senior pastor and the executive pastor simultaneously. And, just to reiterate something I said last week, I think it bears repeating. You can't compare a lead pastor to a CEO. I think it's important for board members to recognize this, because many board members come from the secular workplace. The CEO, as I said last week, runs in quarters, but a lead pastor has this public final exam every weekend. So back to the XP, that XP role exists to protect the lead pastor's capacity to do their role well. And the executive pastor exists to allow the lead pastor to be a pastor, right? A pastor to the church and a pastor to the staff. The XP is the one who leads the hard conversations, the tough calls. That allows the lead pastor to stay a pastor.
Yeah. And the senior pastor, executive pastor distinction is one of those things that sounds obvious on paper, but it's generally hard to live out, or it can be, especially if you've been doing both of those roles for years and maybe you don't even realize it anymore. Okay. So what about the SLT as a whole, that senior leadership team? What does the team itself have to own together that can't get pushed down to anyone else?
Yeah, if you've ever read our ebook, Take the Lid Off Your Church, these are the 7 roles that we say the senior leadership team can't delegate. So first, they need to model team-based leadership from the top. And let me just give you, that can kind of sound like a generic sentence. Let me give you a few handles on that. So modeling team-based ministry, what does that mean? Well, each of the senior leadership team leaders, they practice the values they expect everyone else to follow, right? They share ownership of the whole ministry, not just individual departments. I had to learn this when I first started on our executive team. I kind of came in with my weekend hat on at every meeting and would glaze over a little bit when we talked about student ministries or other things. And I learned, man, I got to take that hat off when I come in this meeting and just lend my
Right.
gifts to every conversation. So the way decisions get made should reflect a we more than my area type of thing. Couple more. They show what healthy conflicts looks like. They model that by disagreeing well and staying unified while they're disagreeing, but showing how we mind for conflict. A good team-based model does that. And then they also avoid side conversations and triangulation, right? Alignment happens in the room, not in the hallways. Nothing will undermine a senior leadership team more than having side conversations with other staff about things that happen in a senior leadership team. So I won't go into all of these in so much detail, but sometimes I think we can miss the essence of these. The second one is setting direction. So the senior leadership team are the ones who have voices into the directional level of the strategic alignment pyramid. And out of that, they're going to monitor key metrics to make sure the ministry is moving in a healthy direction. Third, coming right out of that, they're going to identifying and implementing the strategies for accomplishing the vision. So this is the team that's identifying, here's what's important for us to work on now. Fourth, leading the staff and volunteers. And again, I think that can sound kind of invisible, but let me talk about a little bit more what I mean. So if you are an effective senior leadership team member, you're ensuring that every leader in your care has clear expectations, they understand their authority, they have a defined lane so that decisions happen at the right level, right? And they don't have to come back up to the senior leadership team. You're also building leadership capacity by coaching and developing your leaders, not just giving tasks away. The senior leadership team really owns that leadership pipeline and succession planning for key roles. They create consistent operating rhythms for teams, right? So as a senior leadership team, we're figuring out what are the regular intersections that our teammates need to make, whether that's one-on-ones, quarterly priority meetings, things like that. And then, of course, within their own responsibility, aligning staff and volunteer teams to the vision, right? So that we are executing consistently, speaking the same thing across departments. Just a couple more. So 5, keeping everyone aligned and focused, which is part of what I just shared. Number 6, they are the ones who are considering and responding to opportunities and threats. This is why they have to get their eyes above the waterline, because they need to be able to see what opportunities and threats are out there right now. And then lastly, facilitating communication with the rest of the staff in church. So things like making sure whatever decisions we made at the senior leadership team meeting are translated into clear, consistent messaging for staff. This is where I use the term pushcading versus cascading. You need to be strategic about when will we communicate, what will we communicate, when will we get it done by, right? We always need to assign an owner for every communication, who will share it with whom, by when, what channel, etc. And then, of course, they have to be masters at communicating the why as well as the what, so that teams understand the reasoning behind priorities and trade-offs. And I say that because I think sometimes there's this big mystery what goes on behind that closed door in senior leadership team meetings. Good SLTs are great at communicating and removing that mystery. So I've talked for a while here, Sean. Beyond those 7, is there anything that you would add?
Well, one that I've heard you say many times before and help a lot of churches with is that every person and every ministry needs to connect back to someone on the senior leadership team, just from that structural perspective. If there are staff or ministries that are floating around without leadership that's connected back to the vision of the church, that's a big structural gap that needs fixed. Also, meetings matter. The SLT meeting agenda needs to be action oriented. It needs to have an honest assessment of the numbers and trends and things that are happening within the church. Everybody needs to be involved in the conversation. Like you mentioned before, you've got to take off this is my weekend ministry hat and put on your ownership hat for the whole church. If someone doesn't need to be there, that decision probably should have just been an email, right?
Right. And we don't need to talk it out.
That's right. We have a lot of questions that come to us about meetings and meeting structure and what should be included in those meetings. And I think that's actually the fact we get those questions is an indicator that right now a lot of the meetings aren't good. So Here's a sample agenda framework for what a healthy SLT meeting could look like. Start by opening with a win or a story of life change that you've heard about or experienced in the church recently. That keeps the main thing, and keeps us focused on why we're here. Then move into a quick scorecard review of all your key metrics. You know, our friend and founder Tony Morgan talked about those key metrics like the dashboard on our car, right? And when you see red, that little red flashing light come on, that's actually a good thing. It's a warning sign that something's headed in the wrong direction. And this is a team that can dive in and begin to diagnose why and fix it. So reviewing those metrics are really important. Make sure that you address one or two strategic decisions or cross-ministry alignment issues. So what are those key things, again, that rise up to the top to this team that when you have representation of all of the ministries within your church, you can really bring strategic alignment to? And then close with any communication the broader team needs to carry. What do we need to make sure then filters down through all of the lanes within our structure that this team has connection to? So make sure those meetings are short, engaging, everybody gets to participate. And then you'll have a lot better meeting, and we'll probably have a lot less questions about meetings at the end of the day too.
True.
All right, this is great, Amy. Let's make this really practical now. So if a lead pastor is driving to work today and they're saying, okay, yeah, our senior leadership team is not actually functioning as a team right now, what's the first question that they need to sit with?
Yeah. First question, does every staff member in ministry connect back to someone on the senior leadership team? You just mentioned that, but I think that's a important question. Like, here's what I see once in a while. There's like this random direct report to the lead pastor who's not on the SLT, right? That's someone who's floating out there, right? If there are people floating without clear leadership connected to the vision, you've got some silos. And often those positions I see are more about the person than strategic ministry alignment. It's someone who has reported there for a long time or, a lot of reasons. And then the second question, I would look at your senior leadership team meeting and assess, like, is it action oriented? Is it honest? Or is it mostly just reporting and status updates or talking about this weekend? I think the quality of your senior leadership team meeting is pretty good proxy for whether the team is actually functioning as a team.
Here's the one thing I think catches a lot of churches off guard. What about the churches that are in a really exciting season right now? You know, their church is growing, attendance is up, energy is good overall. Is there a real risk that they wait too long to build the SLT structure that they're actually going to need as their church continues to grow?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is the momentum trap we talked about a little bit last week. You know, I think growth feels like the validation that, hey, everything is working, but the structure that got you here won't get you there. And if you don't build the senior leadership team intentionally during growth, you'll be forced to build it after burnout. I mean, this is where you, in those exciting moments, this is where you should do the activities like, let's double the size of our organization and start to think about what the structure is going to look like then, so that you have like informed, good thought around priority positions and things that you need to add. I'm just an advocate, like for growing churches, every 18 to 24 months, you should still be asking, do we have the right people on the senior leadership team? And this just goes to the principle that different people have different leadership capacities. So the team that was right at 500 may not be the right team when you're a church of 1,000 or a church of 2,000. You don't need to be manic with changing it up, but the church is changing and the team probably has to change with it too. There are oftentimes we need to add diversity. We need to leverage that team for a new leader to come on board and get a voice around the table. And I think the last thing I'd say about that, waiting too long, is when we wait too long, we get to kind of panic hiring and we just start to fill roles. What we really need to do, especially for growing churches, is hire for leadership capacity. The right people on the senior leadership team matters more than the right titles. You need big picture thinkers, strategic thinkers, people who can build teams, and people who are fully aligned with the vision and values. If someone on your team is a good person, but isn't a great leader, I would just find another role for them, just not on the senior leadership team.
That's a really helpful reminder. Amy, I think we've probably overwhelmed pastors right now up to this point with information about how they can create and make better their senior leadership team. So let's wrap up episode 2 for today. Any final thoughts before we do?
I want to leave lead pastors with this. The senior leadership team is so critical for growing churches. If the senior leadership team isn't healthy, then the church won't be healthy. And over time, the lead pastor and the senior leaders won't be healthy either. So it's just a really important part of a healthy, growing church. And I think getting this right is one of the most important decisions a lead pastor will make, because it really determines whether leadership is sustainable, right? Go slowly in who you put on the team. Be honest about whether you have that integrator role. And then that integrator, man, protect the lead pastors for non-delegatable roles so they're not swallowed up by the operations. And then build a team who are genuinely empowered to lead so problems get solved where they belong instead of always ending up at the top of the org chart. Sean, we've got 2 more episodes in this series. And next week, I'm excited to have Cody Thompson from the Table Group on the podcast. We'll be talking about working genius and about structuring around, for lead pastors, to structure your team around your wiring, understanding your own strengths, and then building the right team around you so that you can lead at your healthiest pace. I know at the Unstuck Group, Tony just had a knack for identifying diversity around our team. And I remember when we took Working Genius, it was just so evident that we had complementary geniuses that made us a good team. Also exposed a couple gaps we have, which we now pay attention to. So I think it's going to be a fascinating conversation with Cody. And then we're going to finish the series with a conversation on probably what everyone thought about when they saw the word burnout. A conversation about personal habits and replenishment to sustain your health for the long haul. So don't miss those.
Absolutely. Well, thanks for being with us for episode 2 of Structured for Burnout. If this conversation is hitting close to home for you, and if you're starting to realize your senior leadership team isn't quite functioning the way it needs to, our team at the Unstuck Group can help. We work with churches to assess their staffing and structure and identify specific moves that create a healthier, more sustainable organization. You can start a conversation with us and our team at theunstuckgroup.com. And also make sure that you're subscribed wherever you listen so that you don't miss the rest of the series. We'll be back next week with a great conversation with Cody Thompson. Until then, have a great week.